So this is a series of conversations about conflict. So I'm going to talk about the prospects for conflict in East Asia, and particularly conflict between the United States and China, although obviously it's a broader dynamic, and many of the issues around the potential for conflict between the United States and China also have to do with relations between and among the countries in the region as well. So I'll touch on that as well. And I think it should be apparent to anybody who follows the the day-to-day headlines that this doesn't feel like an entirely abstract or theoretical question, that there's been growing attention to and concern about the possibility of conflict in the East Asia region. And it's an interesting and somewhat curious fact. On the one hand, if you look at East Asia over the last half century, it's actually been a relatively peaceable region. We obviously had a major conflict in World War II, quite large conflict during the Korean War, and for the United States, a significant conflict with the Vietnam War. But really since the mid-1970s, there have been some sporadic engagements. There was a conflict between China and Vietnam alike, and certainly regional tensions. But this has not been a region that's been characterized by great high levels of conflict. And if you had to make a sort of a broad observation, it seems like it's been a place that has largely focused on economic growth and development. And although there are important differences among countries in the region, it has not been a theater for war. So it seems somewhat surprising that there seems so much attention now on the possibility of conflict. So why is that? How realistic is it? And what might be the sources and causes of conflict? Well, there are, in the past, much of the tension in the region had to do with ideological differences. It was obviously an important front line during the Cold War with significant countries in East Asia, particularly China and the Soviet Union, on one side of the Cold War with some allies, and the United States and its strategic allies on the other side. But that source of conflict disappeared with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the turn away of China from communism, certainly as an aspect of its foreign policy, and arguably significantly as an aspect of its domestic policy. So while there are still differences in perspective on exactly how economies should govern, and certainly differences about domestic political governance around democracy and human rights and the like, there's not a kind of a deep ideological conflict that would be a source of division in the region. Possible exception with North Korea, and we can talk about North Korea. I'm not going to deal with much with Korean Peninsula contingencies, which is certainly in some ways the most obvious flash zone in the region. But it's hard to see ideology as a major source of conflict in the region. And similarly on the economic front, although there are certainly important trade and economic disputes among the countries in the region, what we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly since the advent of reform and opening up in China, is a great deal of convergence on the economic front, and especially a great deal of economic integration. The development of regional and global supply chains, the relationships among the countries in the region, the relatively open trading system that's developed in the region has led to a high degree of interpenetration and interdependence as most of the economies in the region have become very dependent on international trade for their own economic growth, both as a source of raw materials on the one hand and as export-driven economies, particularly for the developing countries, China and the countries of Southeast Asia. So, well, we have trade disputes, arguments about intellectual property, arguments about state capitalism and the like. These don't feel like the kinds of things that would lead to major conflicts. There are obviously some disputes about resources and the like. But on the whole, each of the countries have a great stake in their connections with each other. And most would probably see trade and economic relations as an emollient rather than a source of conflict. So where does the conflict come from? What are the potentials and where are the areas of dispute? Well, one obvious one, and the one that's gotten a great deal of attention, is territory. And it's pretty obvious throughout human history, disputes over territory have been an important source of contention. And there are some significant territorial disagreements within the region, among the countries in the region. A lot has focused on the disagreements between China and its neighbors, particularly with respect to claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But there are other disagreements as well. The countries in Southeast Asia have their own competing claims in the South China Sea. There are disagreements between Japan and Korea over the Takashima, Dokdo Islands, and the like. And so there are some territorial disputes. And yet even those, although they get a lot of headlines, are kind of curious. They're largely about relatively inconsequential land masses, certainly many of these uninhabited islands. They have potential economic consequences, as claimants to territory also are making claims to maritime features and access to maritime-based resources. But even there, fishing is reasonably productive, but it's not the most powerful economic driver for most of the countries in the region. And the subsea resources, oil and gas, are present and non-trivial, but not of the game-changing category that you think about major sources of oil and gas, like in the Persian Gulf, or these remarkable new finds, for example, off Brazil. They're valuable, but even there, these have been around for a while, and until recently, most of the countries in the region have been trying to manage these problems through joint exploration and common efforts. And so while there have been clearly issues around how do you divide up the pie and how would you handle these joint exploration efforts, whether it's in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, until the mid to late 2000s, didn't feel like this too was going to be a reason for countries to go to war. Now, the other great flashpoint over the last 50 years that seemed like a potential source of disagreement were the tensions across the Taiwan Straits. It's a sort of a territorial dispute. Obviously, the PRC views Taiwan as an indispensable and undividable part of China. And there have been great tensions since the Chinese Civil War over Chinese claims and Taiwan's autonomy over the islands of Formosa and the associated islands. But again, there, if you look certainly in the last decade or so, particularly under the KMT government in Taiwan, the differences are there. The long-term question about the resolution of Taiwan's status is a big and consequential issue, but there have been deepened economic ties, the three links, more political engagement across the straits, a little bit of uncertainty about what would happen if the DPP were to win in 2016. But again, it doesn't have that feel, at least in recent years, at least since the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, of a place where a military conflict feels ripe to break out. So why, given this landscape, close economic ties, no obvious major sources of conflict, is there so much attention to the region? Why is it that the Obama administration is so focused on the pivot? Why are there so many articles in both the general journals and the academic journals about the possibility of conflict in East Asia so prominent? And of course, for those of you who are IR students here, you'll recognize that this is the core sense that conflict is in the wings, is in the offing here, goes to some very core perceptions about the nature of the international system and international relations, and particularly about the possibilities of cooperation and conflict during periods of power transitions, right? And that the dominant feature, which has preoccupied both the academics and the theorists and the practitioners, is the fundamental question about whether the rise of China is inherently a source of instability and one that is likely to produce conflict. And again, for all of you IR students, this is a very familiar story that goes back to the place where we all who study international relations begin, which is with Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars. And the fear that the rise of Athens and the fear that it incited in Sparta being seen as the source of the Peloponnesian Wars. And there's been an enormous amount of tension by both practitioners and scholars, particularly in the last decade as China has really dramatically taken off economically, as to whether there is an iron law of international relations and human history that suggests that in a situation where there's a dominant or quasi-hegemonic power like the United States and a rising power, whether that inherently is a source of instability and conflict, or whether the current case can be distinguished from other cases in the past, beginning with Thucydides, but up and through World War I, in which it's possible to manage either a peaceful transition to a new political arrangements with the accommodation of the rising power, or at least a new form of cooperation. And that has preoccupied the great theorists and historians who think about international relations, and is the focus of the book that Mike and I wrote. So how should we think about this? Is it an iron law of history or of international relations? Is this yet another example of the tragedy of international relations, as John Mearsheimer would have it, who's been long predicting that this will be the next great source of conflict, or is something else going on here? Now, the traditional view basically sees this as an inherent source of conflict. The Mearsheimer view that states inevitably compete over power, and that there is an inevitable competition which can often take the form of military conflict unless the dominant power is willing to accommodate the rising power. But history suggests that dominant powers are very unlikely to want to do that because they have to give up things that they don't want to give up. And for those of that view, the realist perspective, and looking at history, they suggest that there's every reason to believe that this rather tragic pattern is likely to repeat itself in East Asia. On the other hand, so that's a very pessimistic assessment that basically says, like it or not, and really independent of the specific cases and what's going on in the United States and what's going on in China, that there's reason to believe that this is a relationship which is going to be very conflict prone. On the other hand, there's a set of theoretical perspectives that suggests that whatever is the case with respect to some political power rivalries, that the nature of the current international system is one that should lead us to be more optimistic. The so-called liberal internationalists, people like John Eikenberry and the like, who would suggest that the deep interdependence of states in the current international system, particularly on the economic front, but also other kinds of interdependences, global public health, global climate change, all these things in which countries are much more linked together now, suggests that the zero-sum model of international relations, the realist model, is way too pessimistic, and that in fact states now have powerful reasons to cooperate and powerful disincentives to engage in conflict. And whatever the sources of rivalry about power competition, that they will be more than made up for by the strong incentives that states have to capture the plus-sum gains that come from cooperation. And especially if you look at the economic relationships between the United States and China, and the United States and its other trading powers in Asia, it would be irrational, counterproductive, and therefore unlikely that states in the region would go to war, even though they have potential things that they disagree about, like territory and other issues that this incentive to capture the gains of cooperation will, if not a guarantee of peace, at least provide a significant reason for states to be cautious, restrained, and to seek ways to mitigate their differences and to negotiate their differences. So those are the two poles at their most extreme, one that suggests that war is essentially inevitable unless the dominant power capitulates, and at the other extreme one that says that war is practically impossible unless states behave so irrationally that they do things that are hugely damaging to their self-interest. One obviously suggests it doesn't matter what policymakers do, it's going to go badly and we might as well get used to it and prepare for it. You know, understand that war is coming, we better get ready, and each side should take the steps now to prepare itself for the coming conflict. The second suggesting that, you know, all this doom and gloom is misplaced. The forces of international relations are going to accommodate us, and therefore we should not give in to this fear-mongering that the other side is advocating. And then, of course, like most of these things, there are views in between. And the views in between take the form that suggests that war is neither inevitable nor impossible, but that there are a set of circumstances that might lead to conflict, but there also may be things that the states in the region can do to reduce the chances of conflict. And it won't surprise you as well that the view that Mike and I take in the book that comes from both our understanding of the nature of the international system and that region, but also our own engagement in practice, gives us reasons to be neither as optimistic as the liberal internationalists nor as pessimistic as some of the realists. So let's start with why are we less optimistic than the liberal internationalists? And I think the reason is, one, history suggests that even in cases where states have a lot of interdependence and a lot to gain from cooperation and a lot to lose from conflict, that nonetheless they fall into conflict. And as we sit here now, 100 plus 1 years after the anniversary of the onset of World War I, students of World War I see this as kind of a classic case of a circumstance in which there was a tremendous amount of interdependence, including economic interdependence, between the major states of Europe in the beginning of the 20th century, and yet they did go to war. And it was not even that they didn't appreciate the degrees of interdependence and the risks of war, but nonetheless a dynamic developed that ended up being hugely costly for all sides. And at the time, most, if not all, observers, both academics and practitioners, felt that these degrees of interdependence and the cost of conflict would be a reason to avoid war, and yet the Great War happened at enormous cost. And so that tends to motivate one to look at the question about why, even when it appears irrational for conflict to break out, do states engage in conflict. And for us, the most powerful, but not the only reason, to think that the kinds of issues that drove conflict leading to World War I might be present in the current dynamic in East Asia are things that are closely associated with what our students will recognize as the security dilemma, which is a feature of the structural situation of the relationship between a dominant power and a rising power. Those of you who haven't done your IR intro, the security dilemma basically takes the form of a situation in which states who obviously are concerned about their security are uncertain about the intentions of other states. And because they're uncertain about the intentions of other states, they have to prepare for the possibility that the worst intentions may come about. And so a state has to worry that irrespective of the public pronouncements, the protestations of one state or another, that all of their actions are peaceful or intended to be oriented towards cooperation, that in the end that they may have less benevolent designs, and therefore while you may hope for the best, you have to prepare for the worst. But the problem is that this strategy of preparing for the worst, of hedging against the worst, leads you to take measures to protect your security, particularly in terms of military activities, developing military capabilities, deployments, exercises, and the like, which you may view as being defensive, but which the other side views as offensive and threatening. The other side then looking at these inherently ambiguous actions of military modernization, of exercises, training, deployments, and stuff, then draws the similar conclusion that, well, you can't know for sure what the intention is, you have to prepare for the worst. And each develops this spiral of mistrust, leading to more and more actions which deepen the spiral and ultimately lead to conflict. We can talk more about how that dynamic builds and the specific features that develop it. But under uncertainty and in a situation where sides have reasons to mistrust each other, this security dilemma can build up and can lead to circumstances either of unintentional conflict or even, in some cases, preventive war. And we see this dynamic building to some extent in East Asia. That's a structural argument about why conflict might develop. But if you then overlay that with the historical experience of the region itself, the possibility, the risk of the security dilemma and the spiral developing is reinforced. And what are the specifics that takes us out of an abstract danger and into a real one? And that, of course, has to do with the history of the relationships between the countries in the region. And particularly for China, the rising power, its own history over the last 150 years of a sense that during periods of weakness, China has been exploited by other countries and has suffered as a result of its weakness. And therefore, in order to avoid a repetition of this very difficult past, the century of humiliation, needs to take strong measures to guarantee its security, especially in the military front. And those measures that it's taking, which it views as a way to avoid the rapacious behavior of others in the past by building up its military capabilities of making sure that others can't threaten it as they did in the past, leads it to develop capabilities which are seen by others, both regional powers like Japan and the countries of ASEAN, but also as the United States, as potentially threatening to us. And conversely, China looks at the United States, its military capabilities, and now its announced doctrine of the rebalance, the pivot to Asia, and looks through the lens of its own history and sees a situation in which other countries have had a strategy of profiting by China's weakness and understandably interpret the efforts of the United States to sustain its alliances, to keep its military bases in East Asia, to modernize its military capabilities, including military capabilities to attack the Chinese homeland, as a desire to perpetuate a situation in which China is weak and vulnerable and therefore subject to coercion by the United States. Each side therefore seeing each other's actions as threatening, each side seeing its own actions as just a response to the potentially threatening actions of each other. It's a very powerful dynamic, and it's a very hard dynamic to break because no matter how many meetings you have, no matter how many summits you have in which each side solemnly pronounces on the Chinese side that we're committed to peaceful rise, on the United States side that we want a strong and prosperous China and we don't want containment, that each suspects the other of harboring different intentions, and each can find enough in their histories and their relationship to validate the more pessimistic narrative. So, for example, as the United States looks at the Chinese strategy, pessimists, skeptics, cynics on the US side say, oh, it's all Sun Tzu, right? It's all deception, putting off the enemy, the assassin's mace, all that stuff. They're talking the good game, but we know that the historic strategic culture of China and the strategy is deception and the like. And what's worse, it's not just Sun Tzu, it's also Deng Xiaoping and hide and bide, and this is, Deng Xiaoping told us 20 years ago they were going to keep a low profile, but that was only until China was strong enough to be able to achieve its objectives through a different strategy. And now that China is strong and has a more capable navy, et cetera, they're throwing off the caution and the deceptive strategy of hide and bide and are now becoming an aggressive power. And then, of course, the skeptics point to not just the military modernization, but China's actions in the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, on the Chinese side, there's a similar narrative in which they see a United States, which on the one hand talks about, not wanting to continue the Cold War, not wanting to contain China, but sustaining security alliances with countries like Japan and South Korea, which were designed to confront China when it was a communist power, part of a containment strategy of the past. Why is the United States continuing to sustain these security alliances if it doesn't have the intention of keeping China down? Why does it need these bases? Why is it developing these next generation fighters and bombers whose only purpose can be to attack China, missile defense, et cetera, et cetera? You can tell the story. Each side telling itself a credible version of why it mistrusts the long-term intentions of the other and therefore needs to take steps to counter them. And so China sees the U.S. modernization, develops a military strategy designed to push the United States further away so it's less threatening, the so-called anti-access aerial denial strategy, which the United States sees as threatening and an attempt to undermine our alliances. The United States develops air-sea battle, which China sees as an offensive strategy designed to hold China at risk and hold China's strategic interests at risk. It's a very pernicious, very dangerous dynamic, and it exists irrespective of the specific substantive disputes between the two countries. So that's why one needs to be quite worried about the possibility of conflict. At the same time, the story that I've just told is about a set of perceptions and dynamics, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't underlying reasons why the two sides would have powerful interests to live together. That there are lots of interests that the United States and China have in common, especially their interest in long-term peace and stability in the region as a source of economic prosperity. So at the end of the day, how pessimistic you are depends a little bit on whether you think that there are fundamental adverse interests between China and the United States, or whether the sources of conflict are more these perception and strategic dynamics. If it's the latter, then there may be some things that we can do to break this spiral of mistrust and undercut the security dilemma. If it's the former, if our interests really are adverse, and at the end of the day, the two sides cannot live with each other, that the minimum acceptable demands of China are too much for the United States to accept, then we will have conflict, and it's really irrespective of the security dilemma. So are the two sides' interests irreconcilable? The answer is it's hard to know, right? Because the question about what kind of world both China and the United States can live with is still one that is both unknown and currently undefined. From the US perspective, is China prepared, on the one hand, to play a larger role in the international system, to have a greater voice, to have some kind of reasonable satisfaction of its territorial disputes in the waters off China, but is willing to live with a world in which China can't dominate its neighbors, doesn't impose its own version of the Monroe Doctrine in East Asia? If that's true, if China has a relatively bounded set of demands and largely is prepared to live in a world in which it can accommodate, the interests of its neighbors, then it is possible to think about a modus vivendi and an understanding between the United States and China. On the other hand, if at the end of the day China's minimum objectives is in fact to force the United States out of East Asia and to create a new security arrangement in East Asia which is China-centric and which recreates the kind of Ming-era tributary system in which the other states, although nominally independent and autonomous, accommodate themselves to Chinese leadership, then we may have sources of conflict. And the bottom line and the major focus of our book is trying to figure out whether it's possible to decide which of those two worlds we live in. Are we living in a world in which the sources of conflict between the United States and China are driven by security dilemmas and mistrust about intentions that could be dispelled through confidence building and the kinds of measures that are designed to reassure each other about long-term intentions and to prevent a conflict from emerging because solely on the basis of mistrust as opposed to adverse interest. Or in fact, is the security dilemma actually a reflection of deeper and fundamental differences, in which case we better recognize that at the end of the day we are going to have to resolve this either through conflict or one side accepting the other's view. We don't have an answer to that question. We think it's unknown at this point whether the two sides can accommodate their differences. But we think it's imperative that both sides try to address these perceptual problems and to take steps to try to break the security dilemma through a series of confidence building exercises that would at least reveal whether there is a basis for a common and long-term shared modus vivendi or not. And we focus on the areas that are most likely to produce this security dilemma and uncertainty, and they are, in the first instance, nuclear weapons, which have been a major source of security dilemmas in the past and were an important part of the dynamic during the conflict between the US and Soviet Union. Space, which was another area where mistrust, anxiety, and the danger of security dilemmas and the risk of preemptive conflict is very high. Maritime operations, one that we've seen a lot of focus on, and cyber, which we can talk about more in the discussion, but is obviously one of the most dangerous areas because the risk of actions based on mistrust are very high given the difficulty of knowing what the true intentions are, the problems of attribution, the problems of deception in the cyber area being very difficult. And we, throughout the book, go through a number of discussions about possible steps that each side could take to provide each other reassurance about its intentions without undermining each side's ability to take appropriate actions to defend its own security. And our argument is that each side has a responsibility to explore these kinds of confidence building and reassurance measures to at least examine whether there is a possibility for a long-term modus vivendi between the United States and China that doesn't lead to conflict. In the first best case, because if we explore them and it works, then everybody wins. In the second best case, if it doesn't work, at least we understand that the source of conflict is real and fundamental differences that, in the end of the day, each side believes are worth fighting over. That's not a happy outcome, but at least if we're going to have a conflict, it ought to be over real things rather than misperception. So let me stop at that and open it up for discussion.